The F-16 Fighting Falcons screamed across the Nevada desert at Mach 1.2, their pilots confident in their state-of-the-art avionics and digital flight systems. But in a hangar at the far end of Nellis Air Force Base, Captain Samantha Cruz was running her hands along the worn controls of an aircraft most people thought belonged in a museum. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, or Warthog as pilots called it, was older, slower, and built with analog systems that younger pilots mocked as caveman technology. What they didn't know was that in 12 hours, when every digital system on the base would go dark, Samantha's obsolete aircraft would be the only thing standing between a downed rescue team and certain death. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The maintenance hangar at Nellis Air Force Base buzzed with the controlled chaos of pre-dawn preparations, but Captain Samantha Cruz moved through it like a ghost that nobody quite remembered was there. She ran her weathered fingers along the titanium bathtub that formed the A-10's cockpit armor, checking rivets and connection points that the newer technicians had long since relegated to automated diagnostic systems. Her flight suit bore the faded patches of 3 different squadrons, evidence of a career spent moving from base to base as the Air Force gradually phased out close air support missions in favor of high-altitude precision strikes. Still playing with that old pig, Cruz? The voice belonged to Major Derek Williams, the squadron's golden boy who'd never met a regulation he couldn't quote, or a digital display he couldn't navigate, with his eyes closed. He stood in the hangar doorway, his pristine flight suit reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights as he gestured dismissively toward Samantha's aircraft. Command's finally putting those relics out to pasture next month. About time we focused on real combat aircraft. Samantha didn't look up from her pre-flight inspection. She'd heard variations of this conversation for the past 18 months, ever since Colonel Patricia Mason had taken command of the 422nd Fighter Wing, and made it clear that the future belonged to multi-role fighters with glass cockpits and fly-by-wire systems. The A-10s were being sunset, as the official memo put it, a polite way of saying they were being scrapped to make room for more F-35 Lightning IIs, with their billion-dollar development costs and computer systems that could think faster than any human pilot. The Warthogs got more combat hours than your entire squadron combined, Samantha replied evenly, running her hand along the aircraft's distinctive straight-wing design. These birds were built to take punishment and keep flying when everything else falls apart. Williams laughed, the sound echoing off the hangar walls. Yeah, well, that was back when we fought wars with Vietnam-era tactics. Modern warfare is about precision, stealth, and integrated systems. Your analog gauges and mechanical flight controls are about as relevant as a cavalry charge. He pulled out his tablet, the screen glowing with real-time telemetry from the base's training exercises. We've got pilots pulling 7 gigaseconds in F-16s while monitoring 16 different data streams simultaneously. That's the future, Cruz. Not whatever museum piece you're babying. What Williams didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that Samantha wasn't just maintaining the A-10 out of nostalgia. She'd spent the last 3 years studying every manual, every technical order, every piece of documentation related to aircraft systems that could operate without GPS guidance, without digital flight management computers, without any of the interconnected networks that modern combat aviation depended on. She'd learned to fly by instruments that hadn't changed since the 1970s, to navigate using techniques that predated satellite navigation, to engage targets with systems that relied on pilot skill rather than automated assistance. The other pilots called it backward thinking. Samantha called it preparation. Colonel Mason had made her position clear during their last squadron meeting. The A-10 program is being terminated to free up resources for next-generation aircraft. Captain Cruz, you'll be transitioning to the F-35 program within 60 days. I suggest you start familiarizing yourself with modern avionics. The words carried an undertone that everyone in the room understood. Adapt or find yourself assigned to a desk job in some forgotten corner of the Pentagon. But Samantha had seen the classified reports that crossed her desk as the squadron's senior weapons officer. She knew about the increasing frequency of cyber attacks on military networks, about the vulnerability assessments that showed how dependent American air power had become on systems that could be compromised by enemies who didn't need to build better aircraft. They just needed to write better code. She'd read the after-action reports from exercises where entire squadrons had been rendered combat ineffective by simulated electronic warfare attacks that jammed their communications and spoofed their navigation systems. That's why she'd spent her off-duty hours in the base library, poring over manuals for mechanical flight systems and analog weapons targeting. That's why she'd practiced dead reckoning navigation until she could find any point on a map using nothing but a compass and a stopwatch. That's why she'd memorized the performance characteristics of every aircraft in the Air Force inventory, including ones that had been retired before most of her colleagues were born. The younger pilots thought she was stuck in the past. What they didn't realize was that she was preparing for a future where the past might be the only thing that could save them. Captain Cruz. The voice belonged to Technical Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, one of the few enlisted personnel who still understood the A-10 systems well enough to perform major maintenance. "I've got that hydraulics report you requested. The backup manual system is fully operational, but—" She hesitated, glancing around to make sure Williams had moved on to torment someone else. "Ma'am, why are we still maintaining systems that aren't even connected to the main flight computer? Command's been pretty clear about the A-10 status." Samantha looked at the report, noting the meticulous detail that Rodriguez had put into documenting every backup system, every redundant control mechanism, every component that could operate independently of the aircraft's central computer. "Because sometimes, Sergeant, the systems everyone considers obsolete are the ones that keep you alive when everything modern fails." Rodriguez nodded slowly, though Samantha could see the doubt in her eyes. The sergeant was good at her job, but she'd grown up in an Air Force where aircraft were managed by computers and pilots relied on automated systems for everything from engine management to weapons targeting. The idea that someone might need to fly and fight using purely analog systems seemed as foreign to her as using smoke signals for communication. "I'll keep the reports updated, ma'am," Rodriguez said finally, "just in case." Just in case. Those 3 words had driven Samantha's career for the past decade. Just in case the GPS satellites went down. Just in case the communications networks were compromised. Just in case the enemy found a way to turn America's technological superiority against itself. She'd built her expertise around preparing for scenarios that everyone else considered impossible, learning skills that her contemporaries dismissed as relics of a bygone era. As the sun rose over the Nevada desert, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Samantha completed her pre-flight inspection and climbed into the A-10's cockpit. The seat fit her like a well-worn glove, every switch and gauge positioned exactly where 18 months of practice had taught her to expect them. No digital displays cluttered her field of view. No computer-generated voices offered automated assistance. Just analog instruments, mechanical controls, and the kind of direct connection between pilot and aircraft that modern fly-by-wire systems had eliminated in favor of computer mediation. She ran through the startup sequence, feeling the twin General Electric turbofan engines come to life with a rumble that vibrated through the aircraft's titanium frame. The hydraulic systems pressurized with mechanical precision, the flight controls responding to her inputs with immediate, unfiltered feedback. This was flying the way it had been done for generations before computers took over the cockpit. The radio crackled with the morning's flight schedule. F-16s and F-35s were launching for high-altitude intercept training, their pilots confident in their advanced radar systems and beyond visual range missiles. They would spend the day practicing scenarios that assumed perfect information, reliable communications, and enemies who fought according to predictable parameters. Samantha taxied toward a different runway, one that led to the bombing range where she would practice close air support missions using techniques that hadn't changed since the aircraft was first designed. Low and slow, reading the terrain with her eyes instead of synthetic aperture radar, engaging targets that she could see rather than ones identified by data links from distant sensors. The other pilots called it playing in the dirt. What they didn't understand was that she was preparing for the night when playing in the dirt would be the only option left. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The briefing room at Nellis Air Force Base felt like a courtroom where Captain Samantha Cruz was perpetually on trial. She sat in the back row, her flight bag containing hand-drawn tactical maps and laminated quick reference cards that most pilots would consider primitive. Around her, the cream of the Air Force's fighter community tapped on tablets and adjusted their noise-canceling headphones, preparing to absorb the day's intelligence briefing through high-definition displays and surround sound audio systems. Colonel Patricia Mason strode to the front of the room with the confidence of someone who had never questioned whether technology might fail at the worst possible moment. Her presentation clicker activated a wall-mounted screen that immediately filled with satellite imagery, real-time weather data, and threat assessments generated by artificial intelligence algorithms that processed information faster than any human mind could follow. "Gentlemen and ladies," Mason began, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who had climbed the ranks during the golden age of precision warfare, "today marks another milestone in our transition to fifth-generation combat capabilities. As of this morning, the last A-10 Thunderbolt in our inventory has been officially designated for retirement. Captain Cruz will be transitioning to F-35 operations effective immediately." A ripple of knowing smiles passed through the assembled pilots. Samantha felt their glances like pinpricks, each one carrying the unspoken message that she was finally being dragged into the 21st century. Major Williams turned in his seat to catch her eye, his expression mixing triumph with what might have been genuine sympathy for someone who was about to discover how obsolete her skills had become. "The future of air combat," Mason continued, clicking to a slide showing sleek fighter aircraft bristling with sensors and stealth technology, "belongs to platforms that can integrate seamlessly with our broader information warfare capabilities. Pilots who can process multiple data streams while maintaining situational awareness across the electromagnetic spectrum. Warriors who understand that modern conflict is as much about controlling information as it is about kinetic effects." Lieutenant Sarah Thompson, fresh from pilot training and eager to prove herself among the veterans, raised her hand. "Ma'am, what about scenarios where electronic warfare might compromise our networked systems? Shouldn't we maintain some capability for independent operations?" The question hung in the air like an unwelcome intrusion. Mason's expression tightened almost imperceptibly before she smiled with the patience reserved for students who hadn't yet grasped the fundamental principles of their profession. "Lieutenant, that concern reflects outdated thinking about near-peer adversaries," Mason replied, her tone suggesting that Thompson had just asked why they didn't still use carrier pigeons for communication. "Our electronic warfare capabilities are so advanced that any enemy attempt to jam or spoof our systems would be detected and countered within seconds. The redundancy built into modern military networks makes the kind of systemic failure you're imagining effectively impossible." Samantha shifted in her seat, remembering the classified briefing she'd attended where cybersecurity experts had demonstrated exactly how vulnerable those impossible-to-compromise networks actually were. She'd seen simulations where enemy hackers had turned American aircraft against each other, where GPS spoofing had guided entire squadrons hundreds of miles off course, where communication jamming had left pilots flying blind in hostile airspace. But those briefings had been marked with classification levels that made discussing them in this setting impossible. "Captain Cruz," Mason's voice cut through her thoughts like a blade, "since you're our resident expert on legacy systems, perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts on the transition to modern platforms." Every head in the room turned toward Samantha, and she could feel the weight of their expectations. They wanted her to acknowledge that her expertise was outdated, that her insistence on maintaining analog capabilities had been a waste of time and resources. They wanted confirmation that the old ways of flying and fighting were as obsolete as the aircraft she'd spent years mastering. "Ma'am," Samantha said carefully, "I think there's value in maintaining diverse capabilities across the spectrum of potential conflict scenarios. Different missions might require different approaches to—" "Captain," Mason interrupted, her voice sharpening with impatience, "we're not running a museum here. The Air Force has invested billions of dollars developing aircraft and systems that represent the pinnacle of human engineering achievement. The F-35 can do everything your A-10 could do, plus 100 things it couldn't, with better precision, greater survivability, and superior integration with joint forces." Major Williams nodded enthusiastically. "The Lightning's targeting system can engage 12 targets simultaneously, while maintaining stealth profiles that make detection virtually impossible. No pilot could manually track and engage that many threats using analog systems." "That's assuming the targeting system functions as designed," Samantha replied quietly. "What happens when—" "When what?" Mason's voice carried a warning that Samantha was approaching the limits of acceptable discussion. When our multi-billion-dollar defense contractors suddenly forget how to build reliable systems. When our enemies develop capabilities that our best engineers haven't anticipated. Captain, that kind of thinking is exactly why the A-10 program is being terminated. We can't plan for every impossible scenario. The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of F-16s launching from the main runway. Samantha could see the faces around her, each one reflecting variations of the same message: adapt to the future or be left behind by it. These were good pilots, skilled professionals who had trained extensively on systems that represented the cutting edge of military aviation. They weren't wrong to trust in technology that had proven itself in countless exercises and combat operations. But they were missing something that kept Samantha awake at night. They were assuming that tomorrow's wars would be fought according to today's rules, that enemies would be polite enough to engage American forces using conventional tactics that played to technological advantages. They weren't preparing for adversaries who might choose to fight asymmetrically, who might turn America's dependence on complex systems into a critical vulnerability. Captain James Mitchell, one of the squadron's senior F-16 pilots, spoke up from the middle of the room. "Colonel, I've been thinking about some of the scenarios we've seen in recent war games. There have been a few exercises where opposing forces managed to disrupt our communications and navigation pretty effectively. Not saying it's likely, but maybe there's something to be said for pilots who can operate without full system integration." Mason's smile remained fixed, but her eyes showed a flash of irritation. "Captain Mitchell, those exercises are designed to test our systems under extreme conditions that far exceed any realistic threat scenario. The disruptions you're referring to were simulated by teams of specialists, using equipment and techniques that no actual enemy possesses." "With respect, ma'am," Mitchell continued, "how do we know what capabilities our enemies might develop? Technology changes pretty fast these days." "Because," Mason said with the finality of someone who had grown tired of the discussion, "our intelligence services monitor global technological development continuously. We know what's possible and what isn't. We know what threats are real and what threats are theoretical. And we design our training and procurement accordingly." Samantha wanted to point out that the same intelligence services had been surprised by enemy capabilities before, that adversaries had a habit of developing asymmetric solutions that conventional analysis missed. She wanted to mention the briefings where cybersecurity experts had warned about the growing sophistication of state-sponsored hacking groups, about the vulnerability of systems that depended on civilian internet infrastructure, about the possibility that future conflicts might begin in cyberspace rather than physical battlefields. Instead, she remained silent, understanding that this wasn't really a discussion about tactical capabilities or strategic planning. This was about institutional momentum, about career paths that led through advanced technology programs, about budgets that justified themselves through promises of revolutionary capabilities rather than mundane preparations for unlikely scenarios. "The bottom line," Mason concluded, "is that the Air Force is moving forward, and every pilot in this room needs to move forward with it. Captain Cruz, you'll report to F-35 orientation tomorrow morning. Your A-10 experience will be valuable background, but it's time to focus on systems that will actually be relevant to your career advancement." As the briefing ended and pilots filed out discussing their training schedules and maintenance requirements, Samantha remained in her seat. She pulled out one of her hand-drawn maps, a detailed chart of the Nevada desert that showed every canyon, every ridge, every landmark that could be used for navigation without GPS assistance. The paper was worn from repeated folding, marked with notes about wind patterns and emergency landing sites that she'd identified during years of low-altitude flights. Lieutenant Thompson approached as the room emptied, her expression uncertain. "Captain Cruz, I wanted to ask you about what you said earlier. About maintaining diverse capabilities?" Samantha looked up at the young pilot, seeing something in her eyes that reminded her of herself a decade earlier. Thompson was smart enough to ask questions that others were afraid to voice, curious enough to wonder whether the confident assumptions of her superiors might have blind spots. "What specifically did you want to know, Lieutenant?" Thompson glanced around to make sure they were alone. "Well, in my tactical studies courses we learned about redundancy and backup systems. But everything we've been taught assumes that if our primary systems fail, our secondary systems will take over automatically. What if?" She paused, struggling to articulate a concern that went against everything she'd been trained to expect. "What if everything failed at once?" Samantha folded her map carefully, remembering the first time she'd asked herself that same question. Then you'd better hope someone on your team knows how to fly and fight the old-fashioned way. The base library at Nellis Air Force Base had become Captain Samantha Cruz's second home during the long Nevada evenings when most pilots were either at the officers' club or absorbed in the latest flight simulation software. While her colleagues practiced dogfighting scenarios on high-definition screens with haptic feedback systems, Samantha sat at a corner table surrounded by technical manuals that hadn't been checked out in years. The leather-bound volume in front of her bore the faded title Emergency Procedures for Analog Flight Systems and a publication date that preceded the Gulf War. Its pages were yellowed with age, filled with hand-drawn diagrams showing instrument layouts and procedural flowcharts that assumed pilots would need to think their way through problems rather than rely on automated solutions. Most of the concepts it contained had been superseded by computer systems that could diagnose and correct problems faster than any human operator. But Samantha had learned to read between the lines of official doctrine. The same technological advancement that made modern aircraft incredibly capable also made them incredibly dependent on systems that could be compromised, jammed, or simply overwhelmed by circumstances their designers hadn't anticipated. Every computer-controlled system represented both an advantage and a potential point of failure. She traced her finger along a diagram showing manual fuel system management, calculating flow rates and consumption patterns that modern aircraft handled automatically. The math was complex but not impossible, requiring the kind of mental agility that pilots had once considered fundamental to their profession. Now, most aviators relied on digital displays that processed these calculations in milliseconds, presenting clean, simple readouts that eliminated the need for mathematical problem-solving in the cockpit. "Burning the midnight oil again, Captain?" Samantha looked up to see Master Sergeant Robert Chen, the base librarian whose quiet demeanor concealed an encyclopedic knowledge of military aviation history. Chen had served as an avionics technician for 23 years before transitioning to his current role, and he was one of the few people on base who understood why someone might want to study obsolete technical procedures. "Just reviewing some backup procedures, Sergeant," Samantha replied, gesturing to the stack of manuals beside her, trying to understand how pilots managed complex operations before computers took over most of the workload. Chen pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Captain, I've been watching officers check out technical manuals for 15 years. Most of them are looking for specific solutions to immediate problems. But you're different. You're trying to understand the principles behind the procedures." He was right. While other pilots studied to pass examinations or meet training requirements, Samantha was trying to internalize the kind of intuitive understanding that allowed pilots to improvise solutions when standard procedures didn't apply. She wanted to develop the mental flexibility that came from truly comprehending how aircraft systems worked, rather than simply knowing which buttons to push. "My father was a pilot in Vietnam," she said, surprising herself by sharing something personal. "He used to tell me stories about flying missions where nothing worked the way it was supposed to. No radio contact, no navigation aids, sometimes not even reliable engine instruments. But they still completed their missions because they understood their aircraft well enough to work around the failures." Chen nodded slowly. Different kind of flying back then. Pilots had to be engineers, navigators, and tacticians all rolled into one. These days we've specialized everything. We've got pilots who can execute incredibly complex missions but might not know how to manually calculate their fuel consumption or plot a course using dead reckoning. Samantha opened another manual, this one dealing with electromagnetic pulse effects on aircraft systems. The scenarios it described seemed like science fiction, enemy weapons that could disable electronic systems across wide areas, leaving aircraft to operate on purely mechanical backups. But recent classified briefings had suggested that such capabilities were no longer theoretical. Several nations were developing directed energy weapons specifically designed to disrupt the electronic systems that modern militaries depended on. "Sergeant," she said carefully, "in your experience maintaining aircraft systems, how often do you see failures that the computers don't anticipate?" Chen was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "More often than the manufacturers like to admit, Captain. Modern systems are incredibly sophisticated, but they're designed around predictable failure modes. When something unexpected happens, interference from an unknown source, damage from an unconventional weapon, environmental conditions outside normal parameters, sometimes the computers just stop working." He pulled a maintenance log from his briefcase, flipping to a page marked with yellow highlighting. Last month, we had an F-35 that experienced what the official report called anomalous sensor readings. The pilot couldn't get reliable information from any of his primary displays. Everything showed normal on the ground diagnostics, but in flight, the systems were providing contradictory data. Samantha leaned forward, intrigued. What caused it? Officially, a software glitch that was corrected with a patch update. Unofficially, Chen lowered his voice, we think it was interference from some kind of experimental radar system. Something that operated on frequencies the aircraft's computers weren't programmed to recognize. The interesting thing was that the pilot managed to land safely by reverting to basic flight instruments and manual procedures. This was exactly what Samantha had been preparing for. Scenarios where technological superiority became a liability, where pilots needed to fall back on fundamental skills that couldn't be jammed or spoofed. She'd spent months learning to navigate using celestial positioning, to calculate intercept courses using mental arithmetic, to estimate fuel consumption based on engine sound and flight characteristics. The problem, Chen continued, is that we don't train for those situations anymore. We assume that if one system fails, another system will take over. But what happens when the failure affects the entire electronic infrastructure? Samantha had been asking herself that same question for years. Military doctrine assumed that American forces would always maintain technological superiority, that enemies would fight conventional battles where advanced systems provided decisive advantages. But asymmetric warfare meant that weaker opponents looked for ways to neutralize those advantages, to force conflicts into areas where technology mattered less than skill, experience, and adaptability. She pulled out a notebook filled with her own handwritten calculations. Fuel consumption rates for different aircraft configurations, wind drift compensation formulas, engagement parameters for various weapon systems. While her colleagues relied on computer-generated solutions, she was building a mental database of information that would remain accessible even if every electronic system failed. You know what's interesting about the old pilots? Chen said, gesturing to the historical manuals spread across the table. They didn't just know how to operate their aircraft, they understood them. They could diagnose problems by sound, feel changes in performance through the flight controls, compensate for damage or malfunction by adjusting their flying techniques. That was exactly the kind of intuitive connection Samantha was trying to develop. She'd spent countless hours in the A-10, learning to interpret every vibration, every subtle change in engine note, every variation in how the aircraft responded to control inputs. Modern fly-by-wire systems filtered out much of that sensory information, presenting pilots with sanitized, computer-processed feedback that eliminated both unwanted noise and potentially crucial diagnostic data. There's something else you should see, Chen said, standing and walking to a locked filing cabinet. He withdrew a folder marked with security classifications and opened it to reveal satellite photographs of a remote facility in Eastern Europe. This came through intelligence channels last week. Foreign military installation, very high security, no clear purpose according to conventional analysis. Samantha studied the images, noting the massive antenna arrays and the conspicuous absence of aircraft or vehicles. What's the assessment? Electronic Warfare Research Facility. They're developing capabilities specifically designed to disrupt the kind of integrated systems that our entire air doctrine depends on. Not kinetic weapons, information weapons, tools that could render our most advanced aircraft helpless without firing a shot. The implications were staggering. If enemy forces could disable American electronic systems, the technological advantages that military planners had built their strategies around would become liabilities. Stealth aircraft they couldn't navigate, precision weapons they couldn't find their targets, communication systems that couldn't relay orders. All of it reduced to expensive hardware that pilots might not know how to operate manually. How many people know about this? Samantha asked. The intelligence community is aware, but there's institutional resistance to planning for scenarios that would require major changes to existing doctrine. It's easier to assume that our countermeasures will be effective than to prepare for the possibility that they might not be. Samantha closed the manual she'd been reading and looked around the library. Shelves filled with decades of accumulated knowledge about how to fly and fight without depending on computer assistance. Information that had been relegated to historical curiosity status, considered irrelevant to modern warfare requirements. But history had a way of making irrelevant knowledge suddenly crucial again, and Samantha intended to be ready when that happened. The classified briefing room, deep within Nellis Air Force Base's intelligence complex, buzzed with an undercurrent of nervous energy that Captain Samantha Cruz had never experienced before. Unlike the routine squadron meetings where pilots discussed training schedules and maintenance issues, this gathering included representatives from multiple agencies whose presence suggested something far more serious than standard operational planning. Dr. Alexandra Morrison from the Defense Intelligence Agency stood at the front of the room, her civilian clothes marking her as an outsider among the sea of military uniforms. The presentation screen behind her displayed a map of global communication satellites, each point of light representing a critical node in the network that enabled modern military operations. What made the image unsettling was the growing number of red indicators scattered across the display. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Morrison began, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone delivering information that would fundamentally change how everyone in the room understood their professional responsibilities. "What you're about to hear has been classified at the highest levels because of its potential impact on national security and military readiness." Colonel Mason sat in the front row, her usual confidence replaced by an expression of focused concern. Major Williams occupied the seat beside her, his tablet open to take notes, though Samantha noticed his hands remained motionless above the keyboard, as if he wasn't sure what information would be safe to record. "Over the past 6 months," Morrison continued, clicking to a slide showing signal intercepts and technical analysis reports, "our monitoring stations have detected increasing levels of sophisticated electronic warfare testing by multiple foreign adversaries. Not the conventional jamming and spoofing techniques we've prepared countermeasures for, but something entirely different." The next slide showed a timeline of incidents that painted a disturbing picture. Communication satellites experiencing unexplained signal degradation. GPS networks providing inconsistent positioning data over specific geographic regions. Military aircraft reporting intermittent failures of avionics systems that showed no physical damage or conventional electronic interference. "The pattern suggests coordinated development of what we're calling cascade failure weapons," Morrison explained. "Instead of trying to jam or destroy individual systems, these weapons appear designed to overload the error correction algorithms that modern electronic systems use to maintain reliability. The result is a kind of digital vertigo, where computers can't distinguish between real data and corrupted information." Lieutenant Colonel David Hayes from Cyber Command leaned forward in his seat. "Dr. Morrison, are you suggesting that enemy forces have developed the capability to essentially confuse our aircraft computers to the point where they can't function?" "Not just aircraft, Colonel. Any system that depends on interconnected networks for primary operation. The beauty of this approach, from an adversary's perspective, is that it doesn't require destroying our equipment. It just makes that equipment unreliable enough that operators lose confidence in automated systems." Samantha felt a chill of recognition. This was exactly the scenario she'd been preparing for, though even her most pessimistic assumptions hadn't included the possibility of weapons specifically designed to exploit the complexity of modern military systems. She'd focused on conventional electronic warfare threats, not adversaries sophisticated enough to turn America's technological advancement into a strategic vulnerability. "What's our assessment of defensive capabilities?" Colonel Mason asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer wouldn't be reassuring. Morrison exchanged glances with an Air Force cybersecurity specialist before responding, "Limited. Our countermeasures are designed around the assumption that enemy interference will follow predictable patterns, jamming specific frequencies, spoofing known signals, physically damaging equipment. These new capabilities operate at a much more fundamental level, exploiting the basic mathematical processes that allow computers to distinguish between valid and invalid data." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Every pilot present had built their careers around aircraft systems that processed enormous amounts of information automatically, freeing human operators to focus on tactical decision-making rather than mechanical operation. If those systems became unreliable, it would be like asking surgeons to operate while wearing mittens or expecting pilots to navigate while blindfolded. "Sir," Captain Mitchell spoke up from the middle of the room, "what about manual backup systems? Most of our aircraft still have analog instruments for emergency situations." "Most," Morrison replied with emphasis, "but not all. And those that do have manual backups often require pilots with specialized training to operate effectively without computer assistance. Training that has been de-emphasized in favor of systems management and multi-platform integration." Samantha could feel eyes turning toward her, and she understood why. She was probably the only pilot in the room who had deliberately maintained proficiency with manual flight systems, who had studied the kind of backup procedures that most aviators considered obsolete. Her colleagues' dismissive comments about museum-piece aircraft and caveman technology suddenly seemed less amusing. "Captain Cruz," Colonel Mason said, her voice carrying a note of reluctant respect, "you've maintained currency with analog flight systems. In your assessment, how difficult would it be for pilots trained on modern platforms to transition to manual operation under stress conditions?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Samantha could sense the tension in the room, the unspoken concern that years of technological advancement might have created critical vulnerabilities, rather than unassailable advantages. Her answer could either validate the Air Force's modernization strategy or suggest that fundamental changes to training and doctrine were urgently needed. "Ma'am," Samantha said carefully, "manual flight operation requires a different kind of situational awareness than computer-assisted systems. Pilots need to constantly monitor multiple parameters simultaneously, perform calculations that are normally handled automatically, and make adjustments based on sensory input that modern systems filter out. Without extensive practice, the transition could be challenging." "Challenging how?" Morrison asked, her expression indicating that she wanted specific details rather than diplomatic generalizations. Samantha looked around the room, seeing faces that reflected various degrees of skepticism and concern. These were skilled professionals who had mastered some of the most complex machines ever built, but their expertise was built around human-computer collaboration rather than pure human operation. Navigation without GPS requires dead reckoning techniques that most pilots haven't practiced since basic training, she began. Fuel management without computer assistance means manually calculating consumption rates and adjusting for variables like altitude, temperature, and loading. Weapons targeting without automated systems requires pilots to estimate range, wind drift, and target movement using visual references and mental arithmetic. Major Williams shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Those are backup procedures, Captain, important for emergencies but not really relevant to normal operations." "What if normal operations were no longer possible?" Morrison interjected. "What if the electronic warfare capabilities we've been tracking made computer-assisted flight unreliable across entire theaters of operation?" The question transformed the discussion from theoretical planning to immediate operational concern. Samantha could see the mental calculations happening around the room as pilots tried to imagine conducting complex missions without the technological support they'd grown to depend on. "There's another factor to consider," Dr. Morrison continued, clicking to a slide showing training statistics. "Current pilot training allocates approximately 15% of flight hours to manual procedures, with the assumption that computer systems will handle routine operations. If those systems become unreliable, pilots would need to perform tasks they've practiced only under controlled conditions, in combat situations where mistakes have potentially fatal consequences." Captain Thompson raised her hand hesitantly. "Dr. Morrison, what's the timeline for potential deployment of these electronic warfare capabilities?" "Unknown, but recent intelligence suggests that testing has moved from laboratory environments to field trials. We may be looking at operational capability within months rather than years." The room fell silent again as everyone absorbed the implications. Months to prepare for scenarios that could fundamentally change how air power was projected and sustained. Months to develop training programs, update procedures, and ensure that pilots could operate effectively when their most advanced systems became liabilities rather than assets. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Mason said finally, "I think it's clear that we need to reassess our training priorities and operational assumptions. Captain Cruz, I'm assigning you to lead a working group on manual flight procedures and backup systems operation. I want recommendations for immediate training modifications and long-term doctrine changes." Samantha nodded, understanding that her years of seemingly obsolete preparation had suddenly become the foundation for urgent military planning. The skills that her colleagues had dismissed as historical curiosities might soon be the only things standing between mission success and catastrophic failure. As the briefing concluded and officers filed out discussing revised training schedules and equipment assessments, Samantha remained in her seat, staring at the satellite map still displayed on the presentation screen. Each point of light represented a potential vulnerability, a critical system that enemy forces might soon be able to compromise or disable. The future of air combat was about to become a lot more primitive than anyone had anticipated. The emergency alert klaxon at Nellis Air Force Base cut through the pre-dawn darkness with an urgency that Captain Samantha Cruz had never heard before. She jolted awake in her quarters, immediately recognizing that this wasn't the routine testing that occurred every Tuesday morning, or the standard scramble alerts that sometimes interrupted training exercises. This alarm carried the specific pattern that indicated a genuine national security emergency. Within minutes, her phone was buzzing with automated messages directing all pilots to report immediately to the main briefing facility. Samantha threw on her flight suit and ran through the base corridors alongside dozens of other aviators, all moving with the controlled urgency of professionals who understood that real emergencies didn't wait for convenient scheduling. The scene in the briefing room was unlike anything she'd witnessed during her 12 years of military service. Multiple screens displayed real-time intelligence feeds, communication logs, and operational status reports that painted a picture of coordinated chaos across the global military communication network. Colonel Mason stood at the front of the room, her face grim as she waited for the assembled pilots to take their seats. At 0347 hours Eastern Time, Mason began without preamble, monitoring stations detected massive electronic interference affecting military communication satellites over the Pacific Theater. Within 30 minutes, similar interference spread to GPS networks, tactical data links, and aircraft navigation systems across multiple operational areas. The primary display showed a map of the Pacific region with expanding red zones indicating areas where electronic systems were experiencing failures. Samantha could see that the interference pattern wasn't random. It was systematic, methodical, designed to cascade through interconnected networks in a way that maximized disruption while avoiding the kind of obvious jamming signatures that would trigger immediate military response. Current status, Mason continued, her voice tight with controlled tension, is that we have 17 F-35 Lightning aircraft airborne over the South China Sea experiencing intermittent avionics failures. F-16 squadrons at Osan and Kunsan air bases are reporting GPS navigation problems. Most critically, we have a Navy rescue helicopter en route to extract a downed reconnaissance team in hostile territory, and their navigation systems have completely failed. Major Williams raised his hand, his usual confidence replaced by obvious concern. "Ma'am, what about our electronic countermeasures? Shouldn't our defensive systems be able to compensate for this kind of interference?" "Our countermeasures were designed to address conventional jamming and spoofing techniques," Mason replied. "What we're facing appears to be something entirely different. Instead of simply blocking or corrupting signals, this interference is causing our own systems to generate false information that looks legitimate to both computers and human operators." Dr. Morrison appeared on the main screen via secure video link from the Pentagon, her expression even more serious than it had been during the classified briefing 2 weeks earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen, the electronic warfare capabilities we discussed are now operational. Enemy forces have deployed what appears to be a coordinated cascade failure attack, designed to exploit the interconnected nature of modern military systems." The implications hit the room like a physical blow. Every pilot present had trained extensively on aircraft that depended on computer-assisted navigation, automated threat detection, and digital communication systems. If those systems couldn't be trusted to provide accurate information, it would be like trying to fly while suffering from severe vertigo. Possible, but extremely dangerous. "The immediate tactical situation," Morrison continued, "involves a Navy Special Operations rescue team that has been compromised behind enemy lines. They were extracted by helicopter, but the aircraft is now lost in mountainous terrain with no reliable navigation capability. Weather conditions prevent visual navigation, and enemy forces are actively searching for both the helicopter and the original team." Colonel Mason took over the briefing. "Standard rescue protocols call for dispatching additional aircraft with advanced search and rescue equipment. However, given the current electronic warfare environment, any aircraft we send will likely experience the same navigation and communication problems that stranded the original helicopter." Samantha felt her pulse quicken as she began to understand where this briefing was heading. The military's most advanced rescue platforms, helicopters equipped with thermal imaging, GPS navigation, and satellite communication systems, were exactly the kind of technology that would be vulnerable to the electronic warfare attacks currently in progress. "Captain Cruz," Mason said, turning toward Samantha with an expression that mixed reluctance with desperate determination, "your working group on manual flight procedures has become critically relevant much sooner than we anticipated. We need an aircraft that can operate completely independently of GPS navigation, digital communication systems, and computer-assisted flight management." "Ma'am," Samantha replied, her mind already racing through the implications, "the A-10 Thunderbolt has analog backup systems for all primary flight functions, navigation by dead reckoning, communication via standard radio frequencies that don't require satellite links, manual weapons targeting and delivery. It can operate completely independently of the electronic systems currently being compromised." Lieutenant Thompson spoke up from the back of the room. "Captain, what about the weather conditions? If the rescue helicopter couldn't navigate visually, how would manual systems be any more effective?" It was exactly the right question, and Samantha had spent years preparing for exactly this scenario. The A-10 was designed for low-altitude operations in adverse conditions. Its manual navigation systems include radio direction-finding equipment that can track standard beacon signals, terrain-following procedures that don't require GPS reference, and visual navigation techniques that work even in limited visibility conditions. "The aircraft was officially retired from active service," Mason pointed out. "It's no longer part of our operational inventory." "Ma'am, with respect, the aircraft in Hangar 7 is fully functional and maintained to operational standards. Sergeant Rodriguez and I have been keeping all systems current, including the analog navigation and communication equipment that other aircraft have replaced with digital systems." Dr. Morrison's voice came through the speakers with obvious urgency. "Colonel Mason, the window for rescue operations is closing rapidly. Intelligence indicates that enemy ground forces are moving to surround the area where our people are believed to be located. If we're going to attempt a rescue, it needs to happen within the next few hours." Major Williams leaned forward in his seat. "Dr. Morrison, surely our F-16 and F-35 squadrons can adapt to operate without full electronic assistance. These are highly trained pilots flying the most advanced aircraft in the world." "Major," Morrison replied, "the electronic warfare environment has rendered their most advanced capabilities useless or actively dangerous. GPS navigation is providing false position data. Tactical data links are feeding incorrect threat information. Even basic radio communication is being intermittently jammed or spoofed." Samantha could see the mental calculations happening around the room as pilots tried to imagine conducting complex operations without the technological support they'd trained to depend on. The kind of flying she'd been preparing for. Navigation by map and compass, communication via line-of-sight radio, target identification by visual confirmation, suddenly seemed less like historical curiosity and more like essential survival skills. "There's another factor," Mason added grimly. "The rescue team includes Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, our leading expert on the electronic warfare capabilities, currently being deployed against us. If she's captured, the intelligence value to enemy forces would be catastrophic." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the stakes involved. This wasn't just a rescue mission. It was a race to prevent critical national security information from falling into enemy hands. And the only aircraft capable of operating reliably in the current electronic warfare environment was the one that everyone had dismissed as obsolete. "Captain Cruz," Colonel Mason said finally, "I'm authorizing immediate preparation of the A-10 for search and rescue operations. You'll be flying solo into hostile territory with no electronic support, no backup aircraft, and no guarantee that you'll be able to maintain communication with base once you enter the operational area." Samantha stood and saluted. "Understood, ma'am. I'll need 30 minutes for final aircraft preparation and mission planning." As she left the briefing room, Samantha could hear heated discussions breaking out behind her. Pilots arguing about whether manual flight systems could possibly be effective in modern combat environments, intelligence officers debating the risks of sending a single aircraft into enemy territory, commanders wrestling with decisions that could determine whether critical military personnel lived or died. But for Samantha, the debate was over. She'd spent years preparing for exactly this moment, when technological superiority became technological vulnerability, when the old ways of flying and fighting would determine the outcome of life-and-death situations. The hangar was dark and quiet as she approached the A-10, its familiar silhouette reassuring in a way that no amount of advanced avionics could match. This aircraft wouldn't betray her with false information or fail her when electronic systems were compromised. It would fly where she pointed it, fight when she told it to, and bring her home through methods that had worked for decades before computers took over the cockpit. In 30 minutes, she would be alone over hostile territory with nothing but analog instruments, manual controls, and the kind of flying skills that everyone thought belonged in a museum. She'd never been more ready for anything in her life. The A-10 Thunderbolt's engines spun up with a deep, mechanical roar that vibrated through Captain Samantha Cruz's bones as she completed her final pre-flight checks in the pre-dawn darkness. Unlike the sleek whine of modern turbofan engines, the twin General Electric TF-34s produced a sound that spoke of raw power and mechanical reliability, qualities that had suddenly become more valuable than stealth capabilities or digital integration. Master Sergeant Rodriguez worked frantically around the aircraft, conducting final inspections of systems that most maintenance crews had forgotten existed. The analog compass was calibrated and cross-checked against known magnetic references. The mechanical altimeter was verified against ground elevation markers. The radio direction finding equipment, technology that predated GPS by decades, was tuned to emergency beacon frequencies that worked independently of satellite networks. "Captain," Rodriguez called out over the engine noise, "all manual backup systems are green. I've loaded extra flares and chaff in case you encounter surface-to-air threats, and the 30mm ammunition is a mix of armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds for maximum flexibility." Samantha nodded, checking her hand-drawn navigation chart one final time. The route to the rescue zone required flying through 3 different mountain passes, each presenting unique challenges for low-altitude navigation without GPS assistance. She'd calculated headings, estimated flight times, and identified visual checkpoints using techniques that most pilots considered archaic. But these same techniques had guided aviators safely through hostile territory for decades before satellite navigation existed. Colonel Mason approached the aircraft, her expression grave in the harsh glare of the hangar lights. "Cruz, I want to be absolutely clear about what you're facing out there. Intelligence indicates heavy enemy activity in the search area. Surface-to-air missile sites, fighter patrols, and electronic warfare installations specifically designed to disrupt the kind of operations we're attempting." "Understood, ma'am," Samantha replied, strapping on her survival vest loaded with emergency equipment that included a magnetic compass, paper maps sealed in waterproof containers, and a handheld radio operating on frequencies that predated digital encryption. "What's the latest on the rescue team's status?" "Last communication was 47 minutes ago," Mason said, consulting her tablet. "They were moving toward higher ground to establish a better radio position, but enemy forces are converging on their last known location. The window for extraction is closing rapidly." Dr. Morrison's voice crackled through the hangar's communication system via secure satellite link. "Captain Cruz, the electronic warfare environment has intensified since our last briefing. We're seeing systematic attacks on military communication networks across the entire Pacific theater. Any aircraft depending on digital systems for primary navigation or threat detection is experiencing significant operational degradation." This was exactly what Samantha had trained for, scenarios where technological advancement became a liability rather than an advantage. While her colleagues struggled to adapt to unreliable computer systems, she would be flying the way pilots had operated for generations, by skill, experience, and direct sensory input from aircraft that responded predictably to human control. "Ma'am," she said to Colonel Mason, "I'll maintain radio contact as long as possible, but once I enter the mountainous terrain, communication may become intermittent. If I locate the rescue team, I'll attempt to guide them to a suitable extraction point and provide close air support against enemy forces." "Negative on the close air support," Mason replied firmly. "Your primary mission is reconnaissance and communication relay. We can't risk losing you in a firefight when you're the only pilot currently capable of operating effectively in this electronic warfare environment." Samantha understood the logic, but she also knew that rescue missions rarely proceeded according to predetermined parameters. If she found American personnel under fire from enemy forces, standing orders about avoiding engagement would become secondary to the immediate tactical situation. The A-10's 30mm GAU-8 cannon could provide devastating fire support against ground targets, and its armor plating could withstand small arms fire that would disable more lightly protected aircraft. Yax 8. Lieutenant Thompson appeared at the edge of the hangar, having run across the base to catch Samantha before takeoff. "Captain," she called out breathlessly, "I wanted to ask, if this mission succeeds, if manual flight systems prove effective against electronic warfare threats, what happens to the rest of us?" How do we adapt our training and tactics? It was a profound question that cut to the heart of modern military aviation. If enemy forces could neutralize America's technological advantages, every pilot would need to develop the kind of fundamental flying skills that had been de-emphasized in favor of systems management and computer-assisted operation. Thompson, Samantha said, checking her wristwatch against the mission timeline, start studying the same manuals I've been reading. Learn to navigate by dead reckoning. Practice manual fuel calculations. Develop the ability to operate your aircraft without computer assistance. The future of air combat may be a lot more basic than we anticipated. Master Sergeant Chen appeared beside Rodriguez, carrying a handheld GPS unit that he immediately handed back to the maintenance crew. "Captain, I removed the GPS receiver from your navigation panel. In the current electronic warfare environment, it's more likely to provide false information than accurate positioning data. You'll be flying purely on analog instruments and visual references." This decision eliminated her safety net but also removed a potential source of dangerous misinformation. Enemy electronic warfare capabilities were sophisticated enough to make GPS receivers display incorrect coordinates that looked completely legitimate, leading pilots far off course while providing false confidence in their navigation accuracy. By relying entirely on compass headings, elapsed time calculations, and terrain features, she would have information she could trust. "Colonel," Samantha said, saluting Mason, requesting permission to launch. "Permission granted, Captain. Bring our people home." The A-10 taxied toward the runway with mechanical precision, its response to control inputs immediate and unfiltered by computer systems. Samantha could feel every bump in the taxiway through the aircraft's structure, hear every change in engine note as she adjusted throttle settings, sense the aircraft's weight and balance through feedback that modern fly-by-wire systems filtered out in favor of computer-processed information. As she reached the runway threshold, Samantha keyed her radio for what might be the last reliable communication she would have with base. "Nellis Tower, Warthog 1 ready for departure." "Warthog 1, cleared for takeoff. Winds light and variable, visibility unrestricted. Good hunting, Captain." The A-10 accelerated down the runway with deliberate power, its twin engines providing thrust that built steadily rather than the explosive acceleration of afterburning fighters. This was an aircraft designed for sustained operations rather than spectacular performance, built to complete missions through reliability and survivability rather than speed and technological sophistication. As the aircraft lifted off and began climbing toward the mountains, Samantha checked her analog instruments and compared her heading to the hand-drawn navigation chart strapped to her knee. No GPS readout, no digital flight management system, no computer-generated threat displays, just the fundamental tools that had guided military aviators through hostile territory for decades. He o generig comes. The first waypoint was a distinctive mountain peak, visible 40 miles ahead, its snow-covered summit catching the early morning sun. From there, she would follow a series of visual references toward the search area, navigating by techniques that her father's generation had considered routine, but that seemed almost magical to pilots raised on satellite navigation and automated flight systems. Behind her, Nellis Air Force Base fell away into the Nevada desert, its runways filled with advanced aircraft that couldn't operate reliably in the current electronic warfare environment. Ahead lay hostile territory where enemy forces were hunting American personnel, where surface-to-air missiles waited for unwary aircraft, where the outcome of the mission would depend on skills that everyone had assumed were no longer relevant to modern warfare. Samantha checked her compass heading and noted the time on her analog watch. Navigation calculations that computers normally handled in milliseconds would now require mental arithmetic and constant attention to detail. Threat detection that relied on sophisticated radar and infrared systems would depend on visual scanning and situational awareness developed through years of low-altitude flying. The morning sun painted the mountains ahead in shades of gold and purple, beautiful and deadly terrain where the most important battle of her career was about to begin. And for the first time in months, she felt completely prepared for what lay ahead. 40 minutes into hostile territory, Captain Samantha Cruz felt the A-10 Thunderbolt respond to a sudden updraft as she navigated through the narrow mountain pass that marked the entrance to the search zone. Her analog altimeter showed 8,200 feet, exactly matching her calculated altitude based on known terrain elevation and barometric pressure readings she'd manually adjusted for local weather conditions. No GPS confirmation, No digital flight management system, just fundamental navigation techniques that had guided pilots through dangerous terrain for generations. The radio crackled with static as she attempted to contact the stranded rescue team, but the mountain peaks were interfering with line-of-sight communication. Unlike satellite communication systems that could relay signals around obstacles, her handheld radio required direct transmission paths that terrain features could easily block. She would need to get closer to the suspected location before establishing contact. Through her canopy, Samantha could see the landscape that had become a hunting ground for both American rescue personnel and enemy forces seeking to capture them. Dense forest covered the lower elevations, while rocky outcroppings and sparse vegetation marked the higher ridgelines where better radio communication might be possible. According to her hand-drawn tactical map, the rescue team's last known position was in a valley approximately 12 miles ahead. A glint of reflected sunlight caught her attention, and Samantha immediately dropped the A-10 into a defensive descent toward the tree line. Her years of low-altitude flying had taught her to recognize the difference between natural light reflections and the distinctive glare from optical equipment like rifle scopes or missile guidance systems. Someone was watching the sky, and given the current tactical situation, it probably wasn't friendly. The movement saved her life. A surface-to-air missile streaked through the airspace she'd occupied seconds earlier, its exhaust trail marking a near-miss that would have been catastrophic if she hadn't trusted her instincts over any computer-generated threat warning. Modern aircraft would have detected the missile launch through sophisticated radar and infrared systems, but those same systems were currently unreliable due to electronic warfare interference. Samantha had survived through pure situational awareness and immediate reaction. "This is Warthog 1 to any American forces in the area," she transmitted on the emergency frequency, hoping the rescue team's radio was still functional. "I am a friendly aircraft conducting search and rescue operations. Please respond with your location and status." Static filled her headset for nearly 30 seconds before a weak voice broke through the interference. "Warthog 1, this is Rescue Team Alpha. We are pinned down in a ravine approximately grid square." The transmission dissolved into static as enemy jamming intensified. But Samantha had heard enough. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Colonel Chen, the electronic warfare expert whose capture would represent a catastrophic intelligence loss. More importantly, the partial grid reference gave her a rough idea of where to search for survivors who were obviously under immediate threat from enemy forces. She banked the A-10 toward the indicated area, flying barely 50 feet above the forest canopy to avoid detection by radar systems that might still be operational despite the electronic warfare environment. This kind of terrain-following flight required constant attention to topographical features, using ridgelines and valleys to mask her approach while maintaining enough altitude to clear obstacles. The A-10's sturdy construction allowed it to handle the turbulence and sudden altitude changes that would stress more delicate aircraft. Its engines were designed to ingest debris and continue operating, its control surfaces were built to function even with significant battle damage, and its titanium armor could withstand ground fire that would destroy lighter aircraft. A second missile launch forced her into an even more aggressive defensive maneuver, rolling inverted and diving toward a narrow canyon that would mask her heat signature from infrared seekers. The missile impacted harmlessly against a rock face as she disappeared below the ridgeline, but the launch position told her that enemy forces had multiple surface-to-air missile sites positioned to cover the rescue team's probable location. "Rescue Team Alpha Warthog 1, she transmitted while maneuvering through the canyon. "I am taking fire from multiple SAM sites. Can you provide any information about enemy positions or safe approach routes?" "Warthog 1, we count at least 4 missile sites on the surrounding ridgelines, plus infantry forces moving to surround our position. We estimate approximately 2 hours before they can establish a complete perimeter. 2 hours to locate the rescue team, establish a secure extraction point, and coordinate with recovery forces, all while evading surface-to-air missiles and enemy fighters that intelligence reports indicated were patrolling the area." The mission parameters were becoming increasingly challenging, but Samantha had trained for exactly these kinds of scenarios. She pulled the A-10 up from the canyon and began a systematic search pattern, using terrain features to mask her movement while scanning for signs of American personnel. The rescue team would be seeking high ground for better radio communication, but they would also be trying to avoid open areas where they could be spotted by enemy forces. A flash of reflected light from a small clearing caught her attention, and Samantha recognized the distinctive pattern of a military signal mirror being used to attract aircraft attention. The rescue team was signaling from a position that was partially concealed but offered some visibility to overhead aircraft. Rescue Team Alpha, I have visual contact with signal mirror in clearing approximately 2 miles north of your last transmission. Confirm your position. Confirmed Warthog 1, we are in defensive positions around the clearing perimeter. Be advised, enemy infantry is approximately 15 minutes from our location. Samantha could see movement in the forest surrounding the clearing. Enemy forces advancing through the trees with the systematic precision of troops conducting a well-planned capture operation. The rescue team was trapped in an increasingly small defensive perimeter with limited ammunition and no hope of reaching a suitable extraction point without air support. The tactical situation had evolved beyond reconnaissance and communication relay. American personnel were about to be overrun by enemy forces, and she was the only friendly asset in position to provide immediate assistance. Standing orders prohibited engaging in close air support, but those orders had been written before anyone understood how completely electronic warfare could neutralize conventional military capabilities. Rescue Team Alpha, I count approximately 30 enemy personnel advancing on your position from multiple directions. Request immediate permission to engage hostile forces. Colonel Mason's voice crackled through the static, barely audible through the electronic interference that was intensifying as enemy jamming systems focused on her communication frequency. Warthog 1, negative on engagement. Your mission is extraction coordination only. But Samantha could see that extraction coordination would be meaningless if the rescue team was captured or killed before recovery forces could reach them. The enemy forces were moving with confidence that suggested they knew American aircraft were experiencing operational difficulties, that electronic warfare had created a window of vulnerability they intended to exploit. The A-10's 30mm GAU-8 cannon contained 1,350 rounds of mixed ammunition capable of devastating infantry formations and light vehicles. Its armor plating could withstand small arms fire, and its redundant flight systems would continue operating even with significant battle damage. This aircraft had been designed specifically for close air support missions in contested environments. Rescue Team Alpha, Samantha transmitted, making the decision that would define the rest of her military career. Prepare for immediate close air support. Mark your defensive perimeter and take cover. As she rolled into her first attack run, Samantha knew she was disobeying direct orders from her commanding officer. But she also knew that sometimes the right tactical decision and the officially authorized decision were two different things. The rescue team had perhaps 10 minutes before being overrun, and she was the only thing standing between American personnel and capture by enemy forces. The morning sun glinted off her aircraft's titanium armor as she dove toward the tree line, analog instruments providing reliable flight data, while her eyes tracked enemy positions through methods that no computer system could replicate. In the next few minutes, decades of preparation for scenarios that everyone considered impossible were about to determine whether critical military personnel lived or died. The battle for the future of air combat was about to begin. The GAU-8 cannon erupted with a sound like thunder tearing through steel as Captain Samantha Cruz dove the A-10 Thunderbolt toward the enemy forces advancing on the stranded rescue team. Each burst from the 7-barrel rotary cannon sent 30mm rounds downrange at 3,900 rounds per minute, creating devastating impact patterns that scattered the advancing infantry and forced them to abandon their coordinated assault. Through her analog gun sight, a simple optical device that required no computer assistance, Samantha tracked individual enemy positions with precision that came from years of manual targeting practice. While modern aircraft relied on automated fire control systems that were currently compromised by electronic warfare, her weapons delivery depended entirely on pilot skill and direct visual acquisition of targets. Warthog 1, this is Rescue Team Alpha, Lieutenant Colonel Chen's voice crackled through the radio static. Enemy forces are withdrawing to defensive positions. You've bought us some breathing room, but we're still surrounded. Samantha pulled the A-10 into a climbing turn, using a ridgeline to break visual contact with remaining surface-to-air missile sites while maintaining observation of the tactical situation below. The enemy withdrawal wasn't a retreat, it was a tactical repositioning designed to establish better defensive positions for when she ran out of ammunition or fuel. Alpha Team, I count approximately 20 enemy personnel in reinforced positions around your perimeter. My fuel situation allows for maybe 30 more minutes of close air support before I need to consider extraction options. Understood, Warthog 1. Be advised we're tracking additional enemy forces moving toward this location. Estimate company strength reinforcements arriving within 2 hours. The tactical mathematics were becoming increasingly unfavorable. Even if she could neutralize the immediate threats, larger enemy forces would eventually overwhelm the rescue team's defensive position. They needed an extraction plan that didn't depend on electronic systems that enemy forces could compromise or disrupt. Her radio suddenly came alive with multiple transmissions, as communication links that had been jammed or disrupted began functioning intermittently. Through the static, she could hear Colonel Mason's voice attempting to coordinate rescue operations from Nellis Air Force Base. Warthog 1, this is Base Control. What is your current status? Base Control, Warthog 1 has established contact with Rescue Team Alpha and engaged enemy forces threatening their position. Request immediate coordination for extraction operations using aircraft capable of operating without GPS or digital navigation systems. A pause. Then Mason's voice, tight with controlled urgency. Warthog 1, we have been monitoring your engagement through satellite observation. Your actions have been… Another pause. Effective. We are dispatching additional A-10 aircraft equipped for search and rescue operations. Samantha felt a surge of vindication that had nothing to do with personal recognition and everything to do with validation of principles she'd defended for years. The obsolete aircraft that everyone wanted to retire, the analog systems that younger pilots mocked, the manual procedures that seemed irrelevant to modern warfare, all of it was proving essential when technological superiority became technological vulnerability. Base Control, be advised that enemy forces have sophisticated surface-to-air missile capabilities and electronic warfare systems that will compromise any aircraft depending on digital navigation or threat detection. Recommend manual flight procedures and analog navigation for all rescue aircraft. Copy, Warthog 1. We are implementing emergency protocols based on your manual flight procedures documentation. ETA for additional support is 45 minutes. 45 minutes to keep the rescue team alive while enemy reinforcements closed in on their position. Samantha checked her fuel gauge and ammunition counter, calculating engagement parameters that computers would normally handle automatically. She had perhaps 8 more gun runs before ammunition became a limiting factor, and fuel consumption was higher than normal due to low-altitude maneuvering and extended combat operations. A new voice broke through the radio static, Master Sergeant Rodriguez calling from Nellis Air Force Base. Warthog 1, this is ground control. Colonel Mason has authorized immediate preparation of all remaining A-10 aircraft for rescue operations. We're pulling birds out of retirement and equipping them with manual navigation kits based on your recommendations. The irony wasn't lost on her. Aircraft that had been officially retired from service were being rushed back into operation because they possessed capabilities that billions of dollars in advanced technology couldn't replicate under hostile electronic warfare conditions. The museum pieces were about to become the most valuable assets in the Air Force inventory. Another surface-to-air missile streaked past her canopy, forcing Samantha into an aggressive defensive maneuver that took her below the tree line and into a narrow valley where radar guidance would be ineffective. The enemy forces were learning to adapt their tactics, but they were still thinking in terms of conventional air defense against aircraft that would follow predictable flight patterns. The A-10's ability to operate at extremely low altitudes, to maneuver through terrain that would be impossible for faster aircraft, gave her tactical advantages that no amount of electronic warfare could neutralize. She could use mountains and valleys like a submarine uses ocean depths, appearing and disappearing from enemy observation while maintaining pressure on ground forces. Alpha Team, I'm going to make another pass to suppress the SAM sites on your eastern perimeter. When I engage, I need you to move toward the clearing we identified earlier. It's the best available landing zone for extraction aircraft. Roger, Warthog 1. We'll be ready to move on your signal. Samantha lined up for what might be her most critical gun run of the mission. The surface-to-air missile site was positioned on a rocky outcropping that provided excellent fields of fire, but limited cover from air attack. One accurate burst from the GAU-8 cannon would eliminate the threat, but she would have to fly directly through the engagement envelope of at least 2 other missile sites. The A-10 dove toward the target with mechanical precision, its analog flight instruments providing steady, reliable information, as she compensated for wind drift and target movement using calculations she'd practiced thousands of times. No computer-assisted targeting, no automated fire control, just fundamental gunnery skills that connected pilot, aircraft, and weapon system in direct tactical engagement. The cannon burst lasted exactly 2 seconds and sent 43 30mm rounds into the missile position with devastating accuracy. Secondary explosions indicated that she'd hit stored ammunition, eliminating the threat permanently, while creating a spectacular fireworks display that would be visible to friendly and enemy forces across the entire valley. Alpha Team, Eastern SAM site is neutralized. Move now toward the extraction point. Through her canopy, Samantha could see the rescue team members moving with practiced efficiency across terrain that would challenge infantry forces but presented familiar obstacles to special operations personnel. They were covering each other's movement while maintaining defensive capabilities, demonstrating the kind of tactical competence that made their potential capture so dangerous to American security interests. Her fuel gauge was approaching minimum levels for safe return to base, but she could see additional aircraft approaching from the east. 3 A-10 Thunderbolts flying in formation using the manual navigation procedures she documented during months of seemingly pointless preparation. The cavalry was arriving, equipped with capabilities that everyone had assumed were obsolete until electronic warfare made them essential. Warthog Flight, this is Warthog 1. I have Alpha Team moving toward extraction point coordinates marked by smoke. Be advised, multiple SAM sites remain active and enemy ground forces are regrouping for another assault. Warthog 1, this is Warthog 2. We have your smoke and are beginning attack runs to suppress remaining threats. Extraction aircraft are 15 minutes behind us. As the additional A-10s began their own attack runs using manual targeting and analog navigation systems, Samantha realized that this mission represented more than just a successful rescue operation. It was proof that military effectiveness couldn't be measured solely by technological sophistication, that the fundamentals of flying and fighting remained relevant even in an era of digital warfare. 6 months later, Captain Samantha Cruz stood before a joint session of congressional defense committees, wearing the distinguished flying cross that President Martinez had personally presented during a ceremony at the White House. Her testimony about electronic warfare vulnerabilities and the strategic value of analog backup systems had already resulted in major changes to military procurement and training programs. Honorable members, she said, addressing lawmakers who would determine funding for the next generation of military aircraft, the lesson from that rescue mission isn't that old technology is better than new technology. It's that true military effectiveness requires diverse capabilities across the full spectrum of potential conflict scenarios. The committee chairman leaned forward. Colonel Cruz, in your professional assessment, how should the military balance investment in advanced systems with maintaining older capabilities? She'd been promoted twice since the rescue mission, placed in charge of a new training program that taught pilots to operate effectively when electronic systems failed or were compromised. Her obsolete expertise had become the foundation for doctrine that acknowledged technological vulnerabilities rather than assuming technological invincibility. Sir, the future belongs to military forces that can adapt quickly when their assumptions prove incorrect. That means training pilots who can think their way through problems the computers can't solve, maintaining equipment that works when everything else fails, and remembering that the most sophisticated weapon system is only as effective as the human operator who employs it. The hearing room was packed with defense contractors, military officers, and aviation experts who had come to understand that the captain who'd been dismissed as living in the past had actually been preparing for the future. Her manual flight procedures were now taught at every pilot training base. Her navigation techniques were standard curriculum at the Air Force Academy. Her targeting methods were practiced by pilots flying aircraft that cost more per unit than entire squadrons of A-10s. As she concluded her testimony and walked through the corridors of the Capitol building, Samantha reflected on how completely the narrative had changed. The quiet preparation that her colleagues had mocked, the technical skills that everyone considered irrelevant, the aircraft that budget analysts wanted to eliminate, all of it had proven essential when technological superiority became technological vulnerability. The future of air combat would always include amazing advances in computer technology, artificial intelligence, and digital integration. But it would also include pilots who understood that the most important capabilities were the ones you hoped you'd never need, and that true expertise meant being ready for scenarios that everyone else considered impossible. Sometimes the most important victories were won not by those who embraced the future, but by those who remembered the past well enough to survive when the future failed them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.